Welcome to State Minimum Standards Training. I'm Dennis Corcoran with the Local Enforcement Agency Training Program at the California Integrated Waste Management Board. In this module on fires at compost facilities, you'll be hearing from Todd Thalhammer, who's an international expert on fires at solid waste facilities. Todd is also a professional engineer at the Integrated Waste Management Board and a lieutenant at the El Dorado Hills Fire Department. You'll be hearing from him on his insights on how to minimize the impacts of fires in compost. Let's get started.
Let me give you a little bit of background about myself. I'm a waste management engineer, registered civil. I'm also a fireman for El Dorado Hills Fire Department. I've been there for 10 years. I'm a lieutenant. And I've seen a lot of waste debris type fires, compost fires throughout the United States and internationally. I've, should we say, gone to a couple of incidents where I have a lot of lessons learned, and hopefully I can bring some of those perspectives to you. So let's talk about compost fires. It's not a question of if your facility burns, it's a question of when your facility burns. So let's take a look at some ways to be prepared for this particular incident. Temperature monitoring. This is a hot topic. In my experience, we pretty much have two numbers to watch out for, 170 degrees and 200 degrees. At 170 degrees, this is the first temperature you need to look out for. This is where you can start to have some problems. At 200 degrees, you will have problems. Water supply. You first have to check with your local fire authority, but in my opinion, at a minimum, you need 500 gallons per minute at a facility. And let's look at what 500 gallons a minute provides you. On a normal fire engine, 500 gallons a minute is only going to give you approximately 4 attack lines. So this is only for a very small fire. If your facility has a large fire, you're going to need at least 1,000 gallons a minute because the fire service is going to want to use large type nozzles and monitors to protect or suppress your fire. Now, if the large-scale fire has continued, you're going to need multiple hydrants that flow at 1,000 gallons per minute. Ignition sources. While spontaneous combustion is going to be a primary concern on a compost facility, you really need to look at other issues as well. You have smoking, you have equipment, welding, and other types of hazards that will potentially ignite your pile. Fire lanes. At a minimum, they need to be 15 feet wide. Also, try to design your facility so that the fire engine itself has the ability to turn itself around. I recommend that you talk with your local fire authority and test your access issues. Fire plans. I highly recommend them. This is one document that's beneficial to both the fire service and compost operators. It can be as simple as 2 to 3 pages where you'll discuss tactics and strategies, what equipment is available on your facility, but bottom line, your fire plan will help the fire service quickly extinguish your fire. Pile configuration. In my opinion, this is key to your management plan. You need to cover 2 topics. 1, the size of your pile, and 2, the height of your pile. In 2 facilities that I've been to, one in Rhode Island and one in Texas, we had dramatic impacts from these 2 topics. The one in Rhode Island was about 1 million cubic yards of compost in one pile. The one in Texas had a compost facility pile around 5 acres and 100 feet tall. These are 2 topics you need to discuss. Compost fires will happen, but by addressing these issues, you will lessen the economic impact to your facility and environmental damage. Thank you for your time.
Okay, we just saw that video. Are there any comments or observations? Okay, as I go through these slides, we'll have an opportunity to see how Todd has provided answers to some of the questions that are in these slides. So this is the section that describes the State Minimum Standard Regulation. It's included in your binder. The main issues are temperature monitoring, water supply, ignition sources, and fire lanes. So Todd mentioned 2 temperatures. Do you remember what he said? What are they? So 170, 200 Fahrenheit. So this is a photo of one of our inspectors taking a temperature with one of our probes. Not quite 150. Water supply was the other issue. He used the word monitor, and that's a firefighting term for one of those big nozzles that they can put on the ground and direct the water. So he gave you examples of what he considered to be an appropriate water supply, but also suggested for every facility you invite your local fire department out to your site when it's not on fire, so they have more time to plan what they would do when a fire does occur. They can talk about what fire hydrants you have, what the water supply is, if you need a backup supply. Also, ignition sources. A lot of the literature in the news reports will say it's spontaneous combustion, which is heat generation from the biological or chemical oxidation of the material. And some of the reports seem to think it's sort of a foregone conclusion that it just happens. But actually, it happens over a period of time. So if you're monitoring your piles, then you have an idea they're getting too hot and you can take preventive action. But there can be other things of power lines, heavy equipment, smoking on site, people trespassing. So if you do have a fire, part of it is to look at, was it spontaneous combustion? Were there other potential explanations for the fire? Is there something that you can do next time to minimize the problem? And that's the one thing I noticed when I was looking at our Swiss database on sites that did have a fire. I'd go in and look, and most of the time it was not the first fire. There'd be previous reports. And so if it's happening all the time, then you could look and see, is there a common cause, and could you come up with a best management practice to minimize the chances of it happening again or reduce the severity. So this is a photo of a pile under a piece of equipment. So it not only had the fire and the waste itself, but it damaged a very valuable piece of equipment. And then this could lead to other problems if they can't process the waste, and then it's building up, and they might have an odor problem. This is another picture of the same fire, and from here you can see there's power lines there. So one potential aspect is maybe a spark from the power line caused the fire, but another possibility is the fire occurred in the compost material and then potentially could endanger the power lines. So this is a sketch that came from they're now calling it CAL FIRE, the Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, of a real compost fire. And the way the officer created it is the diagram in the upper left-hand corner is the large-scale map showing the office, the transfer station, and where these 3 compost piles were arranged. And then this is a larger map over to the right, and it shows that the piles were about 100 by 50 feet by 20 feet with 25-foot gap in between the piles. And it also notes over here that this pile was 25 feet laterally from the methane gas collection system. And methane's explosive and flammable. So if the fire got big enough, it could damage the methane gas collection system, which would be expensive. It could also trigger an underground fire. So this is sort of a site planning issue of, do you have your compost piles next to something that's flammable, such as a gas collection system or another building? It might be a capacity issue. Do you have enough equipment to process the compost fast enough and move it off-site so it doesn't build up in large piles? And these are all site-specific things that you can discuss with your fire department when they come out when the piles are not on fire. And Todd mentioned fire lanes for the equipment to turn around. And different fire districts will have different size equipment. They'll have different turning radius. And they may have different ideas on what kind of access they want. Also, they may not want to go down a fire lane that's a dead end. They may want a way to get out if they have to. So those are all things that you could discuss with them when they come out for a visit, or as Todd mentioned, you can include them in your fire prevention plan. So this is a photo of some green material that doesn't look like it's been fully processed, and it caught on fire, and in this particular site they were piling it against a brick wall. So that increased the heat. The heat couldn't dissipate, and you get the fire, but it's also difficult for the fire department to get in to fight it, and it's difficult for an operator to get in with heavy equipment and move the pile. This is another photo of the same site, and you can see where there's scorch marks on the wall, and they've been able to move some of the equipment around, and they do have a hose of some kind. It doesn't look like it's a full fire department hose. But you can look at the height of that. At some point, the piles may be too high to effectively fight, and you have to go in and spread them. This is an example of another fire. The piles here are, this one over here is certainly smaller. These are bigger, and there is a lane to get through here. We're not sure if they can make a turn and navigate down the side. And just from reading the fire report on this one, this is a major road on this side, and the smoke from the fire was drifting across a major county road, interfering with the people driving. So fires have impacts other than just destroying the equipment on site, destroying compost. They can irritate the neighbors or the people driving by, and if a site gets a history of having a lot of problems, then the neighbors would be less likely to support or tolerate expansions or siting of other facilities. So there's certainly a benefit in minimizing the problems that do occur. So you can see if your house was downwind from this site, and a lot of the fire departments will allow the piles to burn. If there's not a structure nearby, if there's not a gas collection system or some economically important asset, especially in rural areas, they'll just let the pile burn. So this thing can smoke for days, or in some cases more in weeks. And then obviously this is something that can irritate the neighbors and make it, as I said, difficult to site new facilities. So this is the text that's in the regulations. You could say it's general. It shall provide protection, prevention, control measures, not limited to. But it's not as prescriptive as some of the other standards. And while Todd recommended that fire plans are a good idea, the compost regs do not specifically require a fire prevention plan. However, I'd recommend you create one. And the ones I looked at for the CDI facilities, they vary in specificity and style and content. And I saw one that looked like it was written by a law firm in New York using language that maybe lawyers can understand, but it didn't look very useful. And on the other hand, I saw a 2 or 3 page report that was simply a narrative saying, on such and such a date, I met with Officer Jones from the local fire district. We toured the site. I showed him where the lock gates are. I showed him where my water hydrant is. We discussed this. He has my phone number. I have his phone number. We do annual inspections. And here's the best management practices that we've decided to implement. It was written in understandable language that anyone working at the site could implement. It was pragmatic. I think one I saw they'd installed what they call height poles, where they put in some poles that had gauges on them to show how high it was, 10, 15, 20 feet. So it helped the operators know how high the piles were, and they had a protocol of how high they wanted their piles to be. So that was a pragmatic solution, and it was a living document that seemed like it met a need, and it was useful as opposed to hiring a consultant to write a report that goes in a file that Kitty can see when she does her record inspections. But it's not being used. One of the ideas in the flyer here was I indicated you would learn how to read regulations, so you've just received a hint that if you specifically read the language, you may come up with something that complies with the regulation, and maybe it will pass the straight face test and you won't get sued. As one example, when I was writing the Subtitle D regulations to comply with the federal law that had been implemented, we had to indicate the economic impact of putting in liners and complying with the monitoring and all the requirements of this new federal regulation. And after discussing with our legal office, we came to the position that there was no economic impact in adopting the Subtitle D regulations. And we received some questions, but the argument was the Subtitle D regulations were in effect and implemented by federal lawsuit. And so our adopting the regs in California had no net change and no net impact. So that decision complied with the Office of Administrative Law, and they're adopted. So it's when you're reading the regulations, read them carefully and see how you comply, but then decide if it passes the straight face test. Okay, Scott, thank you for your insights. What Scott indicated was that there's currently a compost fire going on in San Diego. It's an abandoned site, and the smoke is actually interfering with aircraft that are trying to land at a local airport. And once these sites get on fire, it's difficult to put them out, and they can. One interesting thing is when the fire department does show up and they use water, the water can put out the part of the pile that's currently burning. And then the fire department leaves. 2-3 days later, that water has actually been fuel for another fire. The water stimulates chemical oxidation in the waste that's still remaining. That chemical reaction produces heat, and a second part of the pile catches on fire. And that cycle can continue. So one of the long-term solutions is to spread the pile out if you have enough heavy equipment. But when these piles get so big, it's very difficult to move them. The one Todd mentioned, there's one in Texas. The photos, it looked like a profile of Mount Gibraltar. They'd just been piling waste there for at least a year, if not longer. And so a lot was coming in, very little was leaving. And when the fire did occur, it burned for over 30 days. So that's an issue for the LEAs in the room of the Board of Inspectors. If you see a problem, point it out to the operator, and if necessary, issue violations so that these fires don't occur. And if you're an operator, realize that proactive response is good, because if you wait too long, it's going to be a big problem. If Scott's comment was about the Crippen fire, and we have more information than on our website, and there's also information about fires and solid waste, whether they're buried or CDI, and specific information on the Crippen fire. But that's a case study in California where you get these interesting historical situations of where at one point it was in the county, it was grandfathered in, and then it became part of the city, and it had been there for a long time, and then suddenly it catches on fire, and I think the costs involved were in the millions of dollars. So they can be major issues, and in reading the literature on this, I've seen people say, well, it's just compost, it's no big deal, but it does catch on fire, it does cause problems, it makes it difficult to site new facilities, it makes it difficult to expand existing facilities. So I think it's in everybody's best interest to realize that fires do occur, but minimize them as much as possible, and when they do occur, put them out correctly.